"Let's auction off my sick mother-in-law. Starting bid at $1. My daughter-in-law said, lifting her champagne glass as if she were delivering the most charming joke of the evening. And for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath before a ripple of laughter spread across the tables, soft at first, then louder, as if people weren't quite sure whether they were allowed to laugh, but decided to anyway. I sat there in my seat, hands folded neatly in my lap, the crystal stem of my untouched glass cool against my fingers, and I smiled, not because I found it amusing, but because after 72 years of life, I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is nothing at all, at least not right away. The wedding reception had been held in a grand hotel overlooking the Hudson, the kind of place with towering windows and soft golden lighting that made everything feel warm and expensive, the kind of place I had helped pay for, though no one had mentioned that detail tonight. And as I looked around the room, I saw familiar faces, friends, distant relatives, business associates of my late husband, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them pretending this was just another harmless toast, just another playful jab meant to entertain. But I noticed the subtle shifts too, the way a woman at the next table lowered her eyes, the way an older gentleman cleared his throat and looked down at his plate, and I knew then that not everyone found it funny. Across the room, my son Daniel stood beside Ashley, his arm loosely around her waist, his smile tight and uncertain, as if he were trying to decide whether to laugh or intervene, and in the end, he chose neither, which somehow felt worse than both. I had spent weeks preparing for this day, choosing a soft lavender dress that Daniel once told me made me look elegant, arranging a gift that I thought would mean something to them, something lasting, something that said I was still part of this family. And I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror that morning, smoothing down the fabric and telling myself that this was a new beginning, that whatever distance had grown between us over the years could be bridged with time, patience, and love. But as the laughter echoed faintly through the ballroom and Ashley lowered her glass with a satisfied smile, I realized that what I had mistaken for distance was something else entirely, something colder, something deliberate. I did not look at her, not yet, and I did not look at Daniel either, because I already knew what I would find in his eyes: avoidance, maybe guilt, but not the kind of loyalty a mother hopes she has earned. Instead, I let my gaze drift to the dance floor where the band was beginning to play again, the soft notes of a jazz standard filling the space as if nothing had happened, as if a woman had not just been reduced to a punchline in front of 100 guests. And I took a slow breath, steady and measured, the kind of breath that comes before a decision is made. Because the truth is, that moment didn't surprise me as much as it should have. Not after the past few months. Not after the small things I had tried to ignore. The missed calls, the quiet exclusions, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. And as I sat there, still smiling, still composed, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't the beginning of their cruelty. It was simply the first time they had chosen to make it public, and more importantly, it was the moment I decided I would no longer pretend not to see it. I did not stand up after her toast, and I did not leave the room, even though every instinct told me that walking away would have been the easier choice, because leaving would have allowed them to believe that I was exactly what they had just painted me to be: fragile, embarrassed, someone who could be pushed aside with a single cruel joke dressed up as humor. So instead I remained seated, my posture straight, my expression calm, and I lifted my glass just slightly, enough to acknowledge the room but not enough to participate in their performance. And then I set it back down untouched. The music swelled again, filling the silence that had followed her words, and people began to move. Conversations resumed in low, cautious tones, as if the entire room had agreed without speaking that what had just happened should be smoothed over, forgotten, absorbed into the evening like a stain that no one wanted to point out directly. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I watched the bubbles rise in the glasses, steady and indifferent. And I thought about how many times I had hosted gatherings like this in my own home, how I had stood in kitchens for hours making sure every detail was right, every guest comfortable, every moment seamless, and how never once had I imagined that I would one day sit in a room like this and be treated as an afterthought, or worse, as entertainment. I could feel eyes on me from time to time, quick glances that disappeared the moment I turned my head, and I recognized that look. The quiet curiosity people have when they sense something is wrong but are too polite to ask, too detached to intervene. And I did not blame them, because they were not the ones who had built a life around the belief that family meant something unbreakable. Across the room, Ashley leaned in close to Daniel, whispering something that made him nod, and then he looked away again, avoiding my gaze with a precision that felt practiced. And that was when a memory surfaced, small but sharp, from just a few months earlier, when I had called him on a Sunday afternoon, the same way I had done for years, and he had let it ring, and then later sent a brief message saying he had been busy, that he would call back, and he never did. And at the time I had told myself that people get busy, that life changes, that I needed to adjust. But sitting there now, with the echo of Ashley's words still lingering in the air, I understood that those moments had not been random. They had been part of a pattern I had chosen not to see. There had been other signs too, quieter ones, like the way Ashley would smile at me in public but speak over me in private, or how decisions about the wedding had been made without my input, explained to me afterward as if I were a guest rather than family. And each time I had accepted it, telling myself that it was their day, their life, their choices, and that my role was simply to support, to be gracious, to step back when needed, because that is what I had always done. That is what I believed a mother should do. But as I sat there in that ballroom, listening to the soft clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversations that carefully avoided what had just happened, I realized that stepping back had slowly turned into being pushed out, and that the line between respect and erasure had been crossed so gradually that I had almost missed it entirely. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress, smoothing the fabric over my wrist, a small, controlled movement that grounded me, and I allowed myself one slow breath, then another, not to calm down, because I was already calm, but to steady the clarity that was beginning to settle in my mind, because this was no longer about a single moment, a single toast, or even a single person. It was about understanding the truth of where I stood in this family now, and more importantly, deciding what I was going to do about it. There was a time when I believed that respect within a family did not need to be demanded, that it was something that grew naturally from years of quiet sacrifice and steady presence. And I carried that belief with me through decades of marriage, motherhood, and the slow building of a life that I thought would one day hold me in return. But as I sat in that ballroom, listening to laughter that had already begun to fade into polite conversation, I realized that belief had been quietly rewritten. Without my consent, the first time I noticed something had shifted was not dramatic, not something you could point to and say this is where everything changed. It was smaller than that, almost invisible, like a thread being pulled loose from a carefully woven fabric. And it happened about 6 months before the wedding when Daniel and Ashley invited me over for dinner at their house. A modern place on the outskirts of the city with clean lines and large windows that let in more light than warmth. And I remember bringing a homemade apple pie, the same recipe Daniel used to ask for every fall when he was a boy, and standing at their front door for a moment longer than necessary, because no one had come to greet me right away, which I told myself was nothing, just a delay, just a busy moment inside. When the door finally opened, Ashley smiled in that polished way of hers, the kind of smile that showed all the right teeth, but never quite reached her eyes, and she stepped aside to let me in, already turning back toward the kitchen before I had fully crossed the threshold, as if my arrival was expected but not particularly important. And Daniel, when he appeared, gave me a quick hug, brief and distracted, his attention already pulled somewhere else. Dinner that night was pleasant on the surface, conversation flowing just enough to avoid silence, but never quite settling into anything meaningful. And I noticed how often Ashley redirected topics, how she would answer questions that were not directed at her, how she gently corrected small details and stories I had told about Daniel's childhood, as if reshaping the narrative to fit something more convenient. And each time I let it pass, because correcting her would have made things uncomfortable, and I had spent a lifetime avoiding unnecessary discomfort for the sake of peace. But there was a moment, a small one, that stayed with me long after I left that evening, when I mentioned that I had been thinking about downsizing my home, not because I needed to, but because it seemed practical at my age, and Ashley's eyes had lit up in a way that was almost too quick to catch, followed by a casual remark about how difficult it must be to manage a house alone, how exhausting it could become, and how there were so many wonderful senior communities these days with amenities and support, and she said it all with a tone that sounded helpful, thoughtful even. But there was something underneath it, something that did not sit right, like a suggestion that had already been decided before it was ever spoken. I remember Daniel nodding along, not adding much, just agreeing in that quiet way of his that I had once interpreted as easygoing, but now began to see as something else, something closer to absence. That night, as I drove home, the city lights stretching out in front of me, I tried to shake off the feeling that had settled in my chest, telling myself that I was reading too much into it, that people my age often made these transitions, that perhaps they were simply concerned. But the thought lingered, subtle and persistent. And over the weeks that followed, similar moments began to appear, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, but together forming a pattern that was harder to ignore. Sitting in that ballroom now, I could trace the line from those quiet conversations to this very moment, and I understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt that what I had once considered concern had never been about my well-being at all. It had been about positioning, about making space, and slowly, deliberately, deciding where I no longer belonged. The pattern did not reveal itself all at once. It never does. It arrives quietly, in fragments that seem harmless until they begin to connect. And I remember another evening, not long after that dinner, when Daniel had invited me to meet with a real estate agent, saying he wanted my opinion on a property he and Ashley were considering, and I agreed, thinking it was a small step back toward the kind of involvement we used to have, the kind where my voice still carried weight. And we met at a sleek office downtown, glass walls, polished floors, the kind of place that felt more like a showroom than a place where decisions about homes were made. The agent greeted them warmly, addressing them by name, and then turned to me with a polite but distant smile, the kind reserved for someone whose role is unclear. And as we sat down, documents were spread across the table, floor plans, financing options, timelines, all of it laid out with careful precision. And I listened as Daniel spoke about square footage, resale value, long-term investment, using phrases that sounded practiced, as if he had already rehearsed this conversation before I ever arrived. Ashley nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, but what I noticed was how often she glanced at me, not to include me, but to measure my reaction, as if she were waiting for something, some confirmation that I would respond the way she expected. At one point, the agent mentioned that the property included a separate guest suite, a small but fully equipped space with its own entrance, and Daniel turned to me with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes and said it could be perfect for me, that it would be convenient, close, manageable, and he said it as if he were offering something generous, something thoughtful. But there was a subtle finality in his tone, a quiet assumption that this was already decided, that my agreement was simply a formality. I remember placing my hands on the table, fingers lightly touching the edge of the documents, and asking a simple question: what would happen to my current home, the house his father and I had built together over decades? And for a moment, neither of them answered. There was a brief pause, just long enough to be noticeable, and then Ashley spoke, her voice smooth, reassuring, explaining that it might be best to sell it, that it would relieve me of the burden, that the market was strong and it was the perfect time. And she spoke as if she were solving a problem I had not realized I had. Daniel nodded again, adding that it would simplify things, that it would allow me to focus on comfort and ease. And as I listened, I felt that same quiet shift inside me, the one that had begun months earlier, growing clearer now, sharper, because this was no longer a suggestion, it was a direction, a path they were gently but firmly guiding me toward. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked at the plans again, at the neat lines and carefully labeled rooms, at the small guest suite that had already been assigned to me without my consent. And I realized that they were not trying to include me in their future, they were trying to contain me within it, to define the space I would occupy and the limits of my presence. And they expected me to accept it with gratitude. I left that meeting with the same composed expression I had worn throughout, thanking the agent, smiling politely, stepping out into the afternoon light as if nothing had unsettled me. But as I walked to my car, I understood something I had not allowed myself to fully admit before, that the decisions being made were not about my comfort or my well-being. They were about control, about shifting ownership, about quietly moving me from the center of my own life to the margins of theirs. And sitting in that ballroom now, with the memory of that meeting settling into place beside everything else, I knew that what had happened tonight was not an isolated moment of cruelty. It was the culmination of a plan that had been unfolding in plain sight, one careful step at a time. It was not long after that meeting that someone finally said something to me that no one else had been willing to say out loud, and it did not come from family, which somehow made it both easier and harder to hear. It came from Robert Hayes, an old friend of my late husband, a man who had known us for over 30 years, someone who had sat at our dining table more times than I could count, someone who had watched Daniel grow from a quiet boy into the man he had become, and I ran into him one afternoon at a small cafe just a few blocks from my house, the kind of place where people linger over coffee and conversations stretch longer than expected. He greeted me warmly, the way people do when they remember you as you were, not as you are being redefined, and we sat down together, exchanging the usual pleasantries, talking about the weather, about the neighborhood, about the way time seems to move faster the older you get, and for a while, it felt almost normal, almost comforting, but then there was a shift, subtle at first, the way his expression changed when I mentioned the wedding, the way he hesitated just slightly before asking how everything was going, and I recognized that hesitation. I had seen it before in others, the careful pause of someone deciding whether to speak honestly or politely. I told him everything was fine, that the preparations were nearly complete, that Daniel seemed happy, and I said it with the same calm tone I had been using for months, the same tone that suggested nothing was wrong, nothing was out of place, and he listened, nodding slowly, but his eyes did not quite match his expression. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, exhaled softly, and said my name in a way that felt heavier than the conversation required. And then he told me something I had not expected, something I had not asked for, but something that once spoken could not be unheard. He said that he had been approached by Daniel a few weeks earlier, not directly, but through a financial advisor. They both happened to know, and that there had been discussions about consolidating assets, about restructuring ownership, about simplifying estate matters in a way that would make transitions smoother in the future, and as he spoke, his words remained measured, careful, but the meaning beneath them was clear. They were making plans that involved my property, my home, my assets, and they were doing it without including me in those conversations. I remember sitting there, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, listening as he explained that he had not intended to interfere, that he believed it was a family matter, but something about the way it had been presented had not sat right with him, something about the urgency, the quiet assumption that decisions had already been agreed upon, and he felt that I should at least be aware. I did not react immediately. I did not question him or ask for details, because in that moment, I did not need more information. I needed to understand what I already had, and as I sat there, the pieces that had once seemed separate began to align with a clarity that was almost unsettling. The dinner conversation, the real estate meeting, the subtle suggestions about selling my home, all of it now connected to something larger, something more deliberate. Robert watched me carefully, perhaps expecting shock or anger or disbelief, but I offered none of those. Instead, I thanked him, simply and sincerely, and we finished our conversation in the same quiet tone it had begun, discussing ordinary things as if nothing significant had just been revealed, because sometimes maintaining composure is not about denial, it is about control. When I left that cafe, I did not feel overwhelmed, I did not feel lost. What I felt was something far more precise, a kind of clarity that sharpens rather than scatters, because for the first time, I was no longer guessing, I was no longer filling in gaps with hopeful assumptions. I was seeing the situation for what it was, and more importantly, I was beginning to understand that if decisions were being made about my life without me, then it was time for me to start making decisions of my own, quietly, carefully, and without asking for permission. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the house felt different, not because anything had changed, but because I was finally seeing it without the quiet filter I had been using for months. The same filter that softened uncomfortable truths into something easier to accept. And as I stepped inside, I paused just long enough to take in the familiar details, the framed photographs along the hallway, the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath my shoes, the faint scent of lavender that had settled into the walls over the years. And I realized that this place, this life, had been built with intention, with effort, with a kind of quiet discipline that does not leave room for carelessness. And yet somewhere along the way, I had allowed others to begin making decisions about it, as if it were no longer mine. I set my purse down on the table near the door, removed my coat, and moved through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because for the first time in a long while, I was not simply passing through my own space, I was evaluating it, understanding it, and more importantly, deciding what needed to be protected. The conversation with Robert had not unsettled me. It had clarified something that had been forming beneath the surface, and with that clarity came a certain responsibility, because once you see something clearly, you can no longer pretend you do not. I made my way into the study, the room where my husband had spent so many evenings reviewing documents, managing accounts, planning for a future that we had always assumed would include stability, and I stood there for a moment, looking at the desk, the neatly arranged files, the order he had always maintained, and I felt something shift again, not emotionally, but strategically, because this was not just a space filled with memories, it was a space filled with information, and information, when understood correctly, becomes leverage. I sat down, opened the drawer he had always kept locked, and retrieved the documents I had not needed to look at in years, not because they were unimportant, but because I had trusted that everything was as it should be, and as I began to review them, line by line, I noticed details that I had once skimmed over, clauses, signatures, ownership structures that now held a different weight, a different meaning, because I was no longer reading them as a wife who trusted the system. I was reading them as a woman who needed to understand exactly where she stood within it. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted across the room, casting long shadows that stretched over the desk, and I worked through each document with steady focus, not rushing, not skipping, because precision matters when decisions are being made quietly, behind closed doors, and as the hours passed, a clearer picture began to form, not just of what I had, but of what could be, taken if I allowed it, and more importantly, how easily that could happen if I remained passive. I closed the final folder and leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly on the armrests, and I allowed myself a single, measured breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done, it was about anticipating what would come next. The situation was no longer uncertain. It was structured, deliberate, and that meant it could be addressed in the same way, with structure, with intention, and without unnecessary noise. I stood up, returned the documents to their place, and turned off the light in the study, leaving the room exactly as I had found it, because outwardly, nothing needed to change yet, not until I was ready, and as I walked back through the house, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt controlled, and for the first time in months, I understood that control had never truly left me. I had simply allowed others to believe that it had. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept poorly, but because my mind had already settled into a rhythm that no longer allowed for hesitation, and as I moved through my routine, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft morning light fill the kitchen, everything felt steady, deliberate, as if each small action carried a quiet sense of purpose that had been missing before. I sat at the table with my cup in both hands, watching the steam rise in thin, twisting lines, and I began to think not about what had been done to me, but about what I was going to do next, because there is a difference between understanding a situation and responding to it, and I had reached the point where understanding was no longer enough. I did not rush into anything. I did not pick up the phone immediately or send messages that would reveal what I knew, because reacting too quickly would only benefit those who believed they were already in control, and control, I had come to realize, is often less about power and more about timing. Instead, I chose to proceed quietly, starting with something simple, something that would not raise suspicion. I scheduled an appointment with my attorney, a man who had worked with my husband and me for years, someone who understood not only the structure of our assets, but also the intentions behind them. And when I sat across from him later that afternoon, I did not begin with accusations or emotional explanations. I began with questions, clear and direct, asking him to walk me through the current state of everything, every account, every document. every provision that had been put in place over the years. He listened carefully, perhaps sensing that something had shifted in the way I was approaching these matters, and as he reviewed the details with me, I paid close attention, not just to the information itself, but to the implications, the ways in which things could be interpreted, adjusted, protected. There were moments when he looked at me with a hint of curiosity, as if he were waiting for me to explain why this was suddenly important, but I offered no such explanation, because I did not need to justify my awareness. I only needed to act on it. By the time the meeting ended, I had made a few decisions, small on the surface, but significant in their effect, changes that would not be visible to anyone outside the documents themselves, but that would ensure that nothing could be moved, transferred, or altered without my direct involvement. And as I left his office, stepping out into the cool afternoon air, I felt something settle into place, not relief, but alignment. The kind that comes when intention meets action. Over the next few days, I continued in the same manner, making quiet adjustments, reviewing accounts, confirming details, each step taken with care, each decision made without announcement. Because the most effective changes are often the ones that no one notices until it is too late to reverse them. I still answered Daniel's occasional messages with the same calm tone, still accepted Ashley's polite invitations when they came, still maintained the version of myself they expected to see, because there was no advantage in revealing anything prematurely. And if they believed that I remained unaware, then that belief would continue to serve me. By the time the wedding day arrived, everything that needed to be in place already was, every document reviewed, every detail confirmed, every possibility considered. And as I sat there in that ballroom, listening to the fading echo of Ashley's words, I understood something with absolute certainty. They believed they were making decisions about my future. They believed they were positioning me within a life they had already outlined. But what they did not understand, what they had never even considered, was that I had already stepped outside of that outline, and the version of me they were trying to control no longer existed. The music continued as if nothing had happened, as if the room had quietly agreed to move forward without acknowledging the shift that had taken place. And I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the rhythm of the evening to settle back into place, because timing, I had learned, is not about reacting when something happens. It is about choosing when something matters. Slowly, I reached for my glass, not to drink, but to hold, to feel the weight of it in my hand, the smooth surface, the cool stem, grounding details that kept everything measured. And then I stood, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but with the same quiet composure I had maintained all evening. And as I rose, a few nearby guests noticed, their conversation softening, their eyes turning in my direction with a curiosity that had been building since the toast. I did not rush to speak. I did not clear my throat or signal for silence. Instead, I waited, just long enough for the subtle shift in the room to complete itself, because people sense intention before they hear words, and when the attention settled, I lifted my glass slightly, mirroring the gesture that had been used moments earlier, but without the performance, without the need to entertain. I looked first at Daniel, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with a calm clarity that did not require explanation, and then at Ashley, whose expression had not yet changed, still composed, still confident, as if she believed the moment belonged entirely to her. And perhaps until that second, it had. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady, even, the kind of tone that carries without needing to be raised, and I began not with a response to what had been said, but with something simpler, something that could not be dismissed as emotion or misinterpretation. I spoke about the day, about the significance of beginnings, about the importance of understanding what we build and what we carry forward, and I could feel the room listening, not because I demanded it, but because I had not given them a reason to look away. I mentioned, briefly, the years that had led to this moment, not in detail, not as a recounting of sacrifice, but as a quiet acknowledgement of time, of continuity, of the foundation that exists beneath every celebration. And then I paused, allowing that idea to settle before shifting, gently but deliberately, to something more precise. I said that in recent weeks, I had taken the time to review my affairs, to ensure that everything was in order, that every decision reflected my intentions clearly and without confusion. and I watched as a few expressions in the room began to change, subtle at first, a tightening of posture, a stillness that replaced casual movement, and I continued, explaining that clarity, I had found, is one of the most valuable things a person can have, especially when others begin to make assumptions on their behalf. I did not accuse, I did not point. I did not raise my voice, because none of that was necessary. The words themselves, placed carefully, were enough. I concluded simply, lowering my glass slightly, and said that moving forward, every decision regarding my life, my home, and everything connected to it would remain exactly where it belonged, with me, and only me, and then I offered a small, composed smile, not directed at anyone in particular, but present enough to signal that there was nothing more to add. For a moment, the room was quiet again, not the uncertain quiet that had followed Ashley's toast, but something different, something heavier, more aware, and as I lowered myself back into my seat, I did not look around to measure reactions. I did not seek confirmation or approval, because the shift had already taken place, not in the room, but in the understanding of it. And for the first time that evening, I knew with complete certainty that whatever they had planned, whatever assumptions they had made, no longer held the same weight they once did. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like something fragile that no one wanted to touch too quickly. And I could feel the shift in the room without needing to look. The subtle recalibration of perception that happens when people realize they may have misunderstood something or someone. The band resumed playing, softer this time, almost cautious, and conversations began again. But they carried a different tone now, less certain, more measured, as if each person was reconsidering what they had just witnessed and where they stood within it. I remained seated for only a moment longer before placing my glass gently on the table, the faint sound of crystal against linen barely noticeable, and then I stood once more, this time without hesitation, because there was nothing left to wait for. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress, a small, habitual motion, and began to walk toward the exit. Not quickly, not in retreat, but with the same steady pace I had carried through every stage of my life. And as I moved through the room, I became aware of the space people gave me, the slight shifts in posture, the way conversations paused just enough to acknowledge my presence without calling attention to it. And I understood that something had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be spoken about openly, but in a way that would linger, near the edge of the dance floor. I passed by a group of guests who had been laughing earlier, and now their expressions were quieter, more thoughtful, and one of them, a woman I recognized only vaguely, offered me a small nod, not of pity, but of recognition, and I returned it with the same composed expression I had maintained all evening. I did not look back at the head table. I did not seek out Daniel or Ashley, because whatever needed to be seen had already been seen, whatever needed to be understood had already been made clear, and there was no value in revisiting it. As I reached the doors of the ballroom, a member of the staff stepped forward to open them, his gesture polite and practiced, and I thanked him softly before stepping into the hallway, where the noise of the reception faded into a distant echo, replaced by the quiet hum of the building, the soft lighting, the calm that exists just outside of celebration. I paused there for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but to acknowledge the transition, the movement from one space to another, from one understanding to the next. And then I continued forward, each step deliberate, each breath steady. Outside, the evening air was cool, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city, the low hum of traffic, the occasional passing voice, all of it familiar, grounding. And I stood for a moment at the top of the steps, looking out over the street, not searching for anything, simply observing, because clarity does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet moments that follow it. I descended the steps slowly, my hand brushing lightly against the railing, and when I reached the sidewalk, I did not hesitate. I did not linger. I simply continued walking, leaving behind the lights, the music, the carefully arranged celebration that had revealed more than it intended to. As I moved forward, I thought not about what I had lost, because nothing of value had truly been taken from me, but about what had been confirmed, what had been clarified, and with that clarity came a certain freedom, the kind that does not need to be announced or explained, because it exists, independently of how others choose to see you. By the time I reached the corner, the hotel was already behind me, its presence reduced to a glow in the distance, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of triumph, not of satisfaction, but of understanding, because they had raised their glasses believing they were defining my place, and in doing so, they had given me something far more valuable than they realized. They had given me the certainty that I no longer needed to remain where I was not respected, and that from this point forward, every step I took would be entirely my own. This emotional story explores the quiet strength of a mother-in-law who is publicly humiliated during her son's wedding when her daughter-in-law turns a celebratory moment into a cruel joke, revealing the hidden tensions beneath what should have been a joyful family gathering. Through subtle observations and restrained reactions, the mother-in-law begins to recognize a deeper pattern of exclusion and manipulation, while the daughter-in-law's behavior exposes a calculated effort to control not only relationships, but also financial decisions and future security. As the story unfolds, viewers are drawn into a powerful narrative of awareness, dignity, and silent resilience, making it one of the most compelling family stories that reflects real-life emotional complexity. Instead of reacting with anger, the mother-in-law carefully reclaims control over her life, demonstrating how clarity and composure can shift power without confrontation, a theme that resonates strongly within meaningful family stories where respect is tested. This story captures the emotional depth of generational conflict, the quiet pain of being underestimated, and the strength it takes to stand firm without raising one's voice, placing it among unforgettable family stories that highlight the importance of self-worth. As the daughter-in-law underestimates her, the mother-in-law transforms from a passive figure into someone who understands the value of timing and strategy, reinforcing why audiences are deeply drawn to authentic family stories rooted in reality. Ultimately, this narrative is not about revenge, but about reclaiming identity and control, offering a powerful message that in the most difficult family stories, true strength lies in calm decisions and unshakable self-respect. Create Character 1. A 72-year-old white American woman. Silver hair, neatly styled. Wearing an elegant lavender formal dress. Calm, dignified expression. Front-facing portrait. Soft, natural lighting. Realistic photography style. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Create Character 2. A 35-year-old white American woman with blonde hair, styled elegantly. Wearing a wedding dress. Confident expression with smirk. Front-facing portrait. Soft, natural lighting. Realistic photography style. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration.